As Jefferson was sworn into his second term, he soon faced difficulties, and more specifically, difficulties abroad. As a matter of policy, Jefferson tried to avoid war. Rejecting permanent alliances, he sought to maintain U.S. neutrality despite increasing pressure from both France and Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. The first major challenge to Jefferson's foreign policy came not from a major European power, but from the piracy practiced by the Barbary states on the North African coast. To protect U.S. merchant ships from being seized by Barbary pirates, Presidents Washington and Adams had reluctantly agreed to pay tribute to the Barbary governments. The ruler of Tripoli demanded a higher sum from Jefferson. Jefferson refused to pay and sent a small fleet to the Mediterranean. This conflict lasted on and off for about 4 years. Although victory was not achieved per se, the U.S. began to show its strength and was able to protect U.S. trading ships in the Mediterranean. So let's look at the causes that led to the War of 1812. At the same time as the Barbary incidents, the Napoleonic Wars continued to dominate the politics of Europe and to shape the commercial economy of the United States. France and Britain attempted naval blockades of enemy ports. They regularly seized the ships' neutral nations and confiscated their cargoes. The chief offender from the U.S. point of view was Britain, since its navy dominated the Atlantic. Most infuriating was the British practice of capturing U.S. sailors who it claimed were British citizens and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. The response to the Napoleonic Wars by Jefferson was the Embargo Act of 1807, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Another example of an incident that aroused American anger and almost led to war was the Chesapeake Leopard affair. In 1807, only a few miles off the coast of Virginia, the British warship Leopard fired on the U.S. warship Chesapeake. 3 Americans were killed and 4 others were taken captive and impressed into the British Navy. Anti-British feelings ran high and many Americans demanded war. Britain claimed the incident was a mistake and apologized. Jefferson declared British ships could no longer dock in American ports and asked state governors to call up their militias. Although Jefferson appeared to prepare for war, he leaned toward and resorted to diplomacy and economic pressure as his response. As an alternative to war, Jefferson persuaded the Democratic-Republican majority in Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. This measure prohibited American merchant ships from sailing to any foreign port. Since the U.S. was Britain's largest trading partner, Jefferson hoped that Britain would stop violating the rights of neutral nations rather than lose U.S. trade. The embargo, however, backfired and brought greater economic hardships to the U.S. than to Britain. The British were determined to control the seas at all costs, and they had little difficulty substituting supplies from South America for U.S. goods. The embargo's effect of the U.S. economy, however, was devastating, especially for the merchant marine and shipbuilders in New England. So bad was the depression that a movement developed in the New England states to secede from the Union. Recognizing that the Embargo Act had failed, Jefferson called for its repeal in 1809 during the final days of his presidency. Even after the repeal, U.S. trade ships still could not legally trade with Britain or France. The Embargo Act became a true blot on Jefferson's presidency and became part of his lasting legacy. After the repeal of Jefferson's disastrous Embargo Act, Madison hoped to end economic hardship while maintaining his country's rights as a neutral nation. The Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 provided the Americans could now trade with all nations except Britain and France. In response, Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810 suggested a restoration of U.S. trade with France and Britain as long as either formally agreed to respect U.S. neutrality. Whomever agreed to this bill first, the U.S. would prohibit trade with their foe. Napoleon jumped at the chance to accept the proposal, and Madison pushed the bill into law. The U.S. ended trade with Britain, and Napoleon quickly went about violating the promise made and even went a step further and seized American merchant ships. The intended outcome was to encourage Britain and France to respect the rights of American shipping. Failure was the true outcome. The consequences of the Non-Intercourse Act forced New England to become self-sufficient. It laid the groundwork for U.S. industrial power, and Jefferson and Madison inadvertently contributed to Hamilton's goal for America to become a manufacturing nation. In addition to economic pressures and failed neutrality, conflict with the American Indians was a continual problem for the restless Westerners. For decades, settlers had been gradually pushing the American Indians farther and farther westward. In an effort to defend their lands from further encroachment, Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Prophet attempted to unite all of the tribes east of the Mississippi River. White settlers became suspicious of Tecumseh and persuaded the governor of the Indiana Territory, General William Henry Harrison, to take aggressive action. In the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, Harrison destroyed the Shawnee headquarters and put an end to Tecumseh's efforts to form an Indian confederacy. The British had provided only limited aid to Tecumseh. Nevertheless, Americans on the frontier blamed the British for instigating the rebellion. Another concern by the U.S. fell with impressment. Britain impressed the U.S. citizens and forced them to serve on British naval ships. Between 1808 and 1811, Britain impressed over 6,000 American sailors. A congressional election in 1810 had brought a new group of young Democratic Republicans to Congress, many of them from frontier states. Known as war hawks because of their eagerness for war with Britain, they quickly gained significant influence in the House. Led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, the war hawk members of Congress argued that war with Britain would be the only way to defend American honor, gain Canada, and destroy American Indian resistance on the frontier. Ever since leading the effort to write and ratify the Constitution, Madison was widely viewed as a brilliant thinker. He had worked tirelessly with Jefferson in developing the Democratic-Republican Party. On the other hand, he was a weak public speaker, possessed a stubborn temperament, and lacked Jefferson's political skills. To Madison's advantage, Hamilton's death led to a weakening in the Federalist Party. Madison took office and was able to pursue an aggressive agenda against Britain. However, a declaration of war did come on June 18, 1812. A similar division of opinion was seen in the presidential election of 1812, in which Democratic-Republican strength in the South and West overcame Federalist and anti-war Democratic-Republican opposition to war in the North. Madison won re-election, defeating DeWitt Clinton of New York, the candidate of the Federalists and anti-war Democratic Republicans. At the outbreak of the war, the Americans struggled with an unprepared military. The U.S. had a 12-ship navy to Britain's 800. The Americans disliked the draft. Pay was very poor for soldiers, and leadership was lacking as well. The U.S. was financially unprepared. Revenue from import tariffs declined, and too much printed money was in circulation with little backing. And on top of that, the nation was divided with little support from the North. The North needed to be able to trade with Britain. And so what they did was they went around this and they traded with Canada throughout the war, undermining the US effort. The Canadian campaign began with the misconception that Canada would fall quickly. The poorly equipped Americans launched a three-part invasion of Canada. The British were successful throughout the campaign, and by 1813, the Americans had retreated. The campaigns of 1813 accomplished cutting the British from supply lines. Harrison defeated the British at the Battle of the Thames, ending up killing Tecumseh and ending the threat of Indian raids, and gave the Americans the upper hand in Ontario. Due to the secret trading relationship between New England and Canada, manufacturing and industry grew while agriculture was devastated. Now on to the Battle of Fort McHenry. Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer, came to negotiate the release of a prisoner. The Battle of Fort McHenry was on the verge of erupting at the time. Key and several others took refuge at the base of a ship that was in Baltimore's harbor. The British bombarded Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor for 25 hours. Please note here, the cannons proved little accuracy and were unable to destroy the fort. In the morning, the American flag remained untouched. It was then that Francis Scott Key wrote The Defense of Fort McHenry, which was later renamed the Star-Spangled Banner and adopted as our national anthem. By 1814, the British were wary of war. Having fought Napoleon for more than a decade, they now faced the prospect of maintaining the peace in Europe. At the same time, Madison's government recognized that the Americans would be unable to win a decisive victory. American peace commissioners traveled to Ghent, Belgium, to discuss terms of peace with British diplomats. On Christmas Eve, 1814, an agreement was reached. The terms halted fighting, returned all conquered territory to the status quo antebellum, and recognized the pre-war boundary between Canada and the United States. The Treaty of Ghent, promptly ratified by the Senate in 1815, said nothing at all about the grievances that led to war. Britain made no concessions concerning impressment, blockades, or other maritime differences. Thus, the war ended in a stalemate with no gain to either side. Okay, so now for the essential question. To what extent did the War of 1812 affect the strength of the Federalists? Be sure to support your interpretation with the following evidence. First, what were the issues the Federalists noted at the Hartford Convention? Secondly, what were the proposals to Congress made by the Federalists at the convention? And lastly, what was the outcome?